I was deep in the digital jungle when I stumbled across The Body Keeps the Score. And let me tell you, I wasn't ready for what I found. Trauma? Yeah, you hear that word tossed around like a cheap insult, but it's more than just a buzzword. This book goes straight for the jugular and rips open the real meaning of it. How trauma doesn't just sit in your mind, but gets embedded deep into your body, like a parasite feeding off your life force. This isn't some woo-woo self-help book. It's backed by cold, hard research. The kind that smacks you in the face and leaves you blinking, trying to wrap your head around how humans manage to carry these invisible scars, sometimes for decades. So buckle up, because I'm about to dive into how Bessel Vander Kul cracks open the human psyche and shows you what it looks like when it's bleeding. Vander Kolk isn't your average therapist sitting in a leather chair spouting cliches. No, this guy's been in the trenches, studying trauma like a battlefield surgeon. He's a professor of psychiatry at Boston University and has spent his life dissecting the twisted ways trauma messes with your brain, your body, and your relationships. If that doesn't grab your attention, his decades of research and experience should. This book isn't just about trauma as some abstract psychological term. It's about post-traumatic stress disorder, child abuse, rape, war, real suffering that alters people on a molecular level. He talks about how trauma literally rewires your brain, makes you hyper-alert, distrustful, and forever feeling like the next disaster is just around the corner. And the worst part, society barely scratches the surface of understanding any of this. Let's get one thing straight. Trauma isn't just something that happens to soldiers crawling through the mud in some foreign war. Sure, war veterans make for dramatic stories, but trauma is so much more pervasive. Did you know that in 2014, 12 million women in the US alone were raped? More than half of them were under 15. Let that sink in for a second. And it doesn't stop there. Every year, 3 million cases of child abuse get reported. Trauma isn't a freak occurrence, it's a plague. And yet, society has the gall to brush it off, pretending like these people can just move on and get over it. This book makes you realize just how deeply this ignorance runs. Trauma isn't just an event, it's a wound that festers. For many, the body becomes a prison where the trauma plays on a loop over and over. Here's the kicker. Trauma literally shuts down parts of your brain. Vander Kolk did an experiment where he had patients relive their trauma while measuring brain activity. You'd think the rational parts of the brain would help them realize, hey, I'm safe now, but no. In PTSD patients, the part of the brain responsible for speech shuts down, along with the part that lets you think rationally. That's why trauma flashbacks feel so real, because in that moment, they are real. The body reacts with the same gut-wrenching terror it felt during the original event. Marcia, one of his patients, relived a car accident where she lost her daughter, and as she went through the memory, her brain froze. No speech, no logic, just pure terror. Her body flooded with stress hormones that didn't go down for hours. This isn't some mental trick, it's biology. But the real gut punch comes when you start thinking about kids. Trauma isn't kind to anyone, but to a child, it's like poison. Their brains aren't even fully developed, and yet they're saddled with these violent, confusing experiences that warp their worldview forever. Vander Kolk talks about an experiment where he showed pictures to kids, simple, everyday stuff, like a dad fixing a car. The kids without trauma made up stories where the dad fixes the car, maybe takes the kids out for ice cream. Normal stuff. But the traumatized kids, they saw the car falling and crushing the dad, or one kid smashing the dad's skull with a hammer. That's trauma. It turns everything dark, makes you expect the worst out of the most mundane situations. These kids grow up to be adults with the same twisted lens. Traumatic memories don't fade like the ones of your wedding day or your first kiss. Nope, they're etched into the brain, sharp as glass. Vander Kolk ran another experiment, asking people to recall happy memories, things like the birth of their child. The details were fuzzy. They remembered feelings, sure, but the specifics? Gone. But ask them to relive their trauma, and it's as if they're right back in that nightmare. Smells, sounds, the way the light hit the room, everything crystal clear, decades later. This isn't a coincidence. Trauma hijacks your memory, making sure the worst moments of your life never dull, never slip into the blurry past. In one study at Harvard, men who had fought in World War II were asked about their memories, and the non-traumatized guys had stories that changed over time, mellowed out. The veterans with PTSD, their memories stayed razor sharp, unchanged for more than 45 years. Trauma doesn't just haunt you, it stalks you through your whole life. Now let's talk about the magic trick that sounds too good to be true. EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a mouthful, but don't let that fool you. This technique is as wild as it sounds. All it involves is moving your eyes back and forth while thinking about the trauma. That's it. And yet, the results are nothing short of mind-blowing. Vander Kolk describes how Kathy, a woman who survived the most unspeakable abuse at the hands of her father, went through this treatment. 8 sessions. That's all it took for her to go from suicidal and haunted to a woman who found peace, who even thought about adopting a child 15 years later. EMDR lets people take the horror of their trauma and repackage it, file it away where it belongs, in the past. It's not fully understood how or why it works, but it's a miracle for many who have lived in the shadow of their memories for too long. And let's not forget that trauma doesn't just warp your mind, it sets up camp in your body too. Marilyn's story hits this point home. She was abused as a child, and while she grew up, it was clear that the trauma had shaped her in ways she didn't even recognize. Lashing out when touched, even in her sleep, like her body was constantly bracing for an attack. And then there was the autoimmune disease that slowly took her eyesight. Vander Kolk points out that this wasn't some freak coincidence. Her body was attacking itself, responding to the years of trauma and stress. It's not just mental. Trauma seeps into the physical realm, like a slow poison that eventually corrupts your organs, your skin, your very cells. When the mind is at war with itself, the body becomes collateral damage. But there's hope. Yeah, you heard me right. One of the most unexpected lifelines for trauma survivors. Yoga. It might sound strange, but the way yoga forces you to be aware of your body, its aches, its stiffness, its vulnerability, is exactly what someone with PTSD needs. Take Annie, a woman who couldn't even bear a simple touch after being raped. Yoga became her therapy. It wasn't easy. At first, even the smallest, most gentle poses sent her body into full panic mode. But she stuck with it, forcing herself to feel the pain, the vulnerability, and eventually the peace that followed. There's a pose called Happy Baby, where you lie on your back, knees bent, feet in the air. It sounds playful, but for Annie, it triggered a flood of memories. Yet over time, she learned to confront those feelings instead of running from them. Yoga became her way of healing the mind through the body. Mindfulness. The word gets thrown around a lot these days, but Vander Kolk doesn't treat it like some fleeting trend. Mindfulness isn't just a buzzword here, it's survival. It's learning to sit with your own pain and not let it swallow you whole. For trauma survivors, this is no small feat. Painful memories, gut-wrenching feelings, they all rush to the surface when you try to sit still and be with yourself. Most people would rather distract themselves with alcohol, drugs, or work. But mindfulness forces you to face the storm head-on. And when you do, something remarkable happens. You realize the storm doesn't last forever. By paying attention to the body's signals, you can start to understand the patterns, the triggers, the little things that set you off. And with that awareness comes power. Power to change, to heal, to grow. Let's talk about how trauma absolutely demolishes relationships. Think about it. If your brain and body are constantly on high alert, how can you ever relax enough to trust someone? You can't. Vander Kolk paints a bleak picture of how trauma sufferers push people away, even the ones they love the most. He talks about veterans who can't connect with their families after war, who only trust other vets because no one else could possibly understand the hell they've been through. And then there are people like Marilyn, who couldn't be touched without flinching. Her trauma had wired her to expect violence from even the gentlest of touches. Imagine trying to maintain a marriage or be a parent when your body reacts to every close moment as a threat. It's no wonder so many relationships crumble under the weight of untreated trauma. Trauma survivors don't just lose sleep, they lose connections, families, love. And then there's neurofeedback, a wild frontier of brain science that promises to rewire your mind from the inside out. Picture this. You're sitting in a chair, watching your brainwaves on a screen in real time. As you start to relax, your brain produces more calming alpha waves, and you get a visual reward for it, like a video game. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but this is real. Vander Kolk shares Lisa's story, a woman whose childhood was a train wreck of abandonment and abuse. By the time she was in her 20s, Lisa was a ball of rage, self-destruction, and chaos. But neurofeedback taught her how to see her brain in action, and more importantly, how to train it to produce the calm it so desperately needed. It's a game changer for people like Lisa, who have spent their lives in survival mode. Neurofeedback isn't mainstream yet, but it's one of the most promising tools we have for trauma recovery. Now here's where things get philosophical. Why do traumatic memories linger like ghosts, refusing to fade into the background like every other event in your life? Vander Kolk points to the way the brain processes trauma. It's like your mind can't integrate it, can't file it away in the right drawer, so it just leaves it lying around. This makes those memories jump out at you whenever they want, like a movie reel on repeat, forcing you to relive them over and over. But here's the thing, those memories are like open wounds that never got stitched up. And until you confront them, until you integrate them into your story, they'll keep bleeding into your present. It's why techniques like EMDR and mindfulness work. They help you take control of the narrative, closing the book on the trauma so you can finally move forward. Trauma, as Vander Kolk says, is stored in the body until you decide to heal it. But here's the brutal truth. Society is failing trauma victims left and right. The resources are there: yoga, EMDR, neurofeedback, mindfulness, but they're not being used nearly enough. Vander Kolk doesn't mince words about this. He's seen firsthand how effective these therapies are, yet most people with trauma are left to fend for themselves, often turning to substances or self-destructive behaviors to cope. The system is broken, and the stigma around mental health isn't helping. People still think of trauma as something you just get over with time, but that's a dangerous lie. Trauma is a beast that needs to be tackled head-on with the right tools, and those tools are often locked behind layers of ignorance, underfunding, and misunderstanding. If you take one thing away from this, it's that trauma treatment needs to evolve, and fast. So here's the good news, and yeah, there is good news. Trauma may sink its claws into your brain, your body, your relationships, but it can be healed. Vander Kolk makes it crystal clear that recovery isn't just possible, it's achievable with the right mix of science and self-awareness. Whether it's yoga, mindfulness, EMDR, or neurofeedback, there are ways to take control of your mind and body again. Trauma doesn't get to write the ending of your story. You do. And as Vander Kolk says, healing isn't just about surviving, it's about thriving, about reclaiming your life from the grip of the past. So, if you're carrying trauma or know someone who is, there's hope. It's hard work, no doubt, but it's the kind of work that gives you your life back. And that's worth fighting for. Thanks for sticking around until the end of this deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. If you got something out of this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to keep these conversations going. Until next time, keep taking care of yourselves and each other.